William McKinley was an American politician and lawyer who served as the 25th President of the United States from March 4, 1897 until his assassination in September 1901. 6 months into his second term, McKinley led the nation to victory in the Spanish-American War, raised protective tariffs to promote American industry, and maintained the nation on the gold standard in a rejection of inflationary proposals. McKinley was the last president to have served in the American Civil War, beginning as a private in the Union Army and ending as a brevet major. After the war, he settled in Canton, Ohio, where he practiced law and married Ida Saxton. In 1876, he was elected to Congress, where he became the Republican Party's expert on the protective tariff, which he promised would bring prosperity. His 1890 McKinley Tariff was highly controversial, which together with a Democratic redistricting aimed at gerrymandering him out of office, led to his defeat in the Democratic landslide of 1890. He was elected Ohio's governor in 1891 and 1893, steering a moderate course between capital and labor interests. With the aid of his close advisor Mark Hanna, he secured the Republican nomination for president in 1896. Amid a deep economic depression, he defeated his Democratic rival, William Jennings Bryan, after a front-porch campaign in which he advocated sound money, the gold standard unless altered by international agreement, and promised that high tariffs would restore prosperity. Rapid economic growth marked McKinley's presidency. He promoted the 1897 Dingley Tariff to protect manufacturers and factory workers from foreign competition, and in 1900, he secured the passage of the Gold Standard Act. McKinley hoped to persuade Spain to grant independence to rebellious Cuba without conflict. But when negotiation failed, he led the nation in the Spanish-American War of 1898. The U.S. victory was quick and decisive. As part of the peace settlement, Spain turned over to the United States its main overseas colonies of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Cuba was promised independence, but at that time remained under the control of the U.S. Army. The United States annexed the independent Republic of Hawaii in 1898 and it became a U.S. territory. Historians regard McKinley's 1896 victory as a realigning election, in which the political stalemate of the post-Civil War era gave way to the Republican-dominated fourth-party system, which began with the Progressive era. McKinley defeated Bryan again in the 1900 presidential election, in a campaign focused on imperialism, protectionism, and free silver. However, his legacy was quickly cut short when he was shot on September 6, 1901 by Leon Czolgosz, a second-generation Polish-American with anarchist leanings. McKinley died 8 days later, and was succeeded by his vice president Theodore Roosevelt. As an innovator of American interventionism and pro-business sentiment, McKinley's presidency is generally considered above average, though his universally positive public perception was soon overshadowed by Roosevelt. Early life and family. William McKinley, Jr., was born in 1843 in Niles, Ohio, the seventh child of William and Nancy, née Allison, McKinley. The family moved to Ohio when the senior McKinley was a boy. Settling in New Lisbon, now Lisbon, he met Nancy Allison there, and married her later. In 1852, the family moved from Niles to Poland, Ohio so that their children could attend the better schools there. Graduating in 1859, he enrolled the following year at Allegheny College in Meadville, Pennsylvania. He remained at Allegheny for only 1 year, returning home in 1860 after becoming ill and depressed. He also spent time at Mount Union College in Alliance, Ohio, where he joined Sigma Alpha Epsilon. He did not graduate from either university. Civil War. Western Virginia and Antietam. When the Southern states seceded from the Union and the American Civil War began, thousands of men in Ohio volunteered for service. After a month of training, McKinley and the 23rd Ohio, now led by Colonel Eliakim P. Scammon, set out for Western Virginia, today part of West Virginia, in July 1861 as a part of the Kanawha Division. That September, McKinley's regiment was called east to reinforce General John Pope's Army of Virginia at the Second Battle of Bull Run. Shenandoah Valley and promotion. While the regiment went into winter quarters near Charleston, Virginia, present-day West Virginia, McKinley was ordered back to Ohio with some other sergeants to recruit fresh troops. McKinley and his regiment moved to the Shenandoah Valley as the armies broke from winter quarters. To resume hostilities, Crook's Corps was attached to Major General David Hunter's Army of the Shenandoah and soon back in contact with Confederate forces, capturing Lexington, Virginia, on June 11. After Cedar Creek, the Army stayed in the vicinity through Election Day, when McKinley cast his first presidential ballot for the incumbent Republican, Abraham Lincoln. On March 7, 1883, McKinley was elected as a first-class companion of the District of Columbia Commandery of the Military Order of the Loyal Legion of the United States, MOLLUS, a military society of officers who served in the Union Armed Forces during the American Civil War, and their descendants. He was assigned MOLLUS insignia number 3029. Legal career and marriage. After the war ended in 1865, McKinley decided on a career in the law and began studying in the office of an attorney in Poland, Ohio. As McKinley's professional career progressed, so too did his social life blossom as he wooed Ida Saxton, the daughter of a prominent Canton family. Ida insisted that McKinley continue his increasingly successful career in law and politics. McKinley's good standing with Labor became useful that year as he campaigned for the Republican nomination for Ohio's 17th congressional district. Rising politician 1877 to 1895. Spokesman for protection. Under free trade, the trader is the master and the producer the slave. Protection is but the law of nature, the law of self-preservation, of self-development, of securing the highest and best destiny of the race of man. McKinley first took his congressional seat in October 1877, when President Hayes summoned Congress into special session. From his first term in Congress, McKinley was a strong advocate of protective tariffs. The primary purposes of such imposts was not to raise revenue, but to allow American manufacturing to develop by giving it a price advantage in the domestic market over foreign competitors. McKinley biographer Margaret Leach noted that Canton had become prosperous as a center for the manufacture of farm equipment because of protection, and that this may have helped form his political views. McKinley introduced and supported bills that raised protective tariffs, and opposed those that lowered them or imposed tariffs simply to raise revenue. McKinley increasingly became a significant figure in national politics. In 1880, he served a brief term as Ohio's representative on the Republican National Committee. In 1884, he was elected a delegate to that year's Republican Convention, where he served as chair of the Committee on Resolutions and won plaudits for his handling of the convention when called upon to preside. By 1886, McKinley, Senator John Sherman, and Governor Joseph B. Foraker were considered the leaders of the Republican Party in Ohio. In 1889, with the Republicans in the majority, McKinley sought election as Speaker of the House. He failed to gain the post, which went to Thomas B. Reed of Maine. However, Speaker Reed appointed McKinley chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. The Ohioan guided the McKinley Tariff of 1890 through Congress. Although McKinley's work was altered through the influence of special interests in the Senate, it imposed a number of protective tariffs on foreign goods. Gerrymandering and defeat for re-election. Recognizing McKinley's potential, the Democrats, whenever they controlled the Ohio legislature, sought to gerrymander or redistrict him out of office. Judge magazine cover from September 1890, showing McKinley, left, having helped dispatch Speaker Reed's opponent in early voting Maine, hurrying off with the victor to McKinley's gerrymandered Ohio district. For 1890, the Democrats gerrymandered McKinley one final time, placing Stark County in the same district as one of the strongest pro-Democrat counties. Holmes, populated by solidly Democratic Pennsylvania Dutch. The new boundaries seemed good, based on past results. For a Democratic majority of 2,000 to 3,000, the Republicans could not reverse the gerrymander as legislative elections would not be held until 1891, but they could throw all their energies into the district. As the McKinley Tariff was a main theme of the Democratic campaign nationwide, and there was considerable attention paid to McKinley's race, the Republican Party sent its leading orators to Canton, including Blaine, then Secretary of State, Speaker Reed and President Harrison. The Democrats countered with their best spokesman on tariff issues. McKinley tirelessly stumped his new district, reaching out to its 40,000 voters to explain that his tariff was framed for the people, as a defense to their industries, as a protection to the labor of their hands, as a safeguard to the happy homes of American workingmen, and as a security to their education, their wages, and their investments. It will bring to this country a prosperity unparalleled in our own history and unrivaled in the history of the world. Quote, Democrats ran a strong candidate and former Lieutenant Governor John G. Warwick to drive their point home. They hired young partisans to pretend to be peddlers, who went door to door offering 25-cent tinware to housewives for 50 cents, explaining the rise in prices was due to the McKinley Tariff. In the end, McKinley lost by 300 votes, but the Republicans won a statewide majority and claimed a moral victory. Governor of Ohio. Even before McKinley completed his term in Congress, he met with a delegation of Ohioans urging him to run for governor. Governor James E. Campbell, a Democrat, who had defeated Foraker in 1889, was to seek re-election in 1891. The Ohio Republican Party remained divided, but McKinley quietly arranged for Foraker to nominate him at the 1891 State Republican Convention, which chose McKinley by acclamation. The former congressman spent much of the second half of 1891 campaigning against Campbell, beginning in his birthplace of Niles. Hanna, however, was little seen in the campaign. He spent much of his time raising funds for the election of legislators pledged to vote for Sherman in the 1892 senatorial election. Even after his final run for president in 1884, James G. Blaine was still seen as a possible candidate for the Republican nomination. In this 1890 Puck cartoon, he is startling Reed and McKinley, right, as they make their plans for 1892. Ohio's governor had relatively little power. For example, he could recommend legislation, but not veto it. But with Ohio a key swing state, its governor was a major figure in national politics. President Harrison had proven unpopular. There were divisions even within the Republican Party as the year 1892 began and Harrison began his re-election drive. Although no declared candidate opposed Harrison, many Republicans were ready to dump the president from the ticket if an alternative emerged. Among the possible candidates spoken of were McKinley, Reed, and the aging Blaine. Fearing that the Ohio governor would emerge as a candidate, Harrison's managers arranged for McKinley to be permanent chairman of the convention in Minneapolis. requiring him to play a public, neutral role. Hanna established an unofficial McKinley headquarters near the convention hall, though no active effort was made to convert delegates to McKinley's cause. McKinley objected to delegate votes being cast for him. Nevertheless, he finished third, behind the renominated Harrison, and behind Blaine, who had sent word he did not want to be considered. Soon after Cleveland's return to office, hard times struck the nation with the Panic of 1893. A businessman in Youngstown, Robert Walker, had lent money to McKinley in their younger days. In gratitude, McKinley had often guaranteed Walker's borrowings for his business. The governor had never kept track of what he was signing. He believed Walker a sound businessman. In fact, Walker had deceived McKinley, telling him that new notes were actually renewals of matured ones. Walker was ruined by the recession. McKinley was called upon for repayment in February 1893. McKinley campaigned widely for Republicans in the 1894 midterm congressional elections. Many party candidates in districts where he spoke were successful. His political efforts in Ohio were rewarded with the election in November 1895 of a Republican successor as governor, Asa Bushnell, and a Republican legislature that elected Foraker to the Senate. McKinley supported Foraker for Senate and Bushnell, who was of Foraker's faction, for governor. In return, the new senator-elect agreed to back McKinley's presidential ambitions. With party peace in Ohio assured, McKinley turned to the national arena. Election of 1896. Further information: United States presidential election, 1896 and William McKinley presidential campaign, 1896. Obtaining the nomination. It is unclear when William McKinley began to seriously prepare a run for president. As Phillips notes, no documents, no diaries, no confidential letters to Mark Hanna, or anyone else, contain his secret hopes or veiled stratagems. Quote, backed by Hanna's money and organizational skills, McKinley quietly built support for a presidential bid through 1895 and early 1896, when other contenders such as Speaker Red and Iowa Senator William B. Allison sent agents outside their states to organize Republicans in support of their candidacies. They found that Hanna's agents had preceded them. According to historian Stanley Jones in his study of the 1896 election, another feature common to the Red and Allison campaigns was their failure to make headway against the tide which was running toward McKinley. In fact, both campaigns from the moment they were launched were in retreat. The calm confidence with which each candidate claimed the support of his own section. Hanna, on McKinley's behalf, met with the Eastern Republican political bosses, such as Senators Thomas Platt of New York and Matthew Quay of Pennsylvania, who were willing to guarantee McKinley's nomination in exchange for promises regarding patronage and offices. McKinley, however, was determined to obtain the nomination without making deals, and Hanna accepted that decision. Louis Dalrymple cartoon from Puck magazine, June 24, 1896, showing McKinley about to crown himself with the Republican nomination. The priests are Hanna, in green, and Representative Charles H. Grosvenor, red. H. Coleside is the page holding the robe. The bosses still hoped to deny McKinley a first ballot majority at the convention by boosting support for local favorite son candidates such as Key, New York Governor, and former Vice President Levi P. Morton, and Illinois Senator Shelby Cullom. Delegate Rich, Illinois proved a crucial battleground, as McKinley supporters, such as Chicago businessman and future Vice President Charles G. Dawes, sought to elect delegates pledged to vote for McKinley at the National Convention in St. Louis. Cullom proved unable to stand against McKinley despite the support of local Republican machines. At the state convention at the end of April, McKinley completed a near sweep of Illinois' delegates. By the time the National Convention began in St. Louis on June 16, 1896, McKinley had an ample majority of delegates. The former governor, who remained in Canton, followed events at the convention closely by telephone, and was able to hear part of Foraker's speech nominating him over the line. When Ohio was reached in the roll call of states, its votes gave McKinley the nomination, which he celebrated by hugging his wife and mother as his friends fled the house. Anticipating the first of many crowds that gathered at the Republican candidate's home, thousands of partisans came from Canton and surrounding towns that evening to hear McKinley speak. From his front porch, the convention nominated Republican National Committee Vice Chairman Garrett Hobart of New Jersey for vice president, a choice actually made, by most accounts, by Hanna. Hobart, a wealthy lawyer, businessman, and former state legislator, was not widely known, but as Hanna biographer Herbert Crowley pointed out, if he did little to strengthen the ticket, he did nothing to weaken it. General election campaign. Before the 1896 convention, McKinley tried to avoid coming down on one side or the other of the currency question. William Allen Rogers's cartoon from Harper's Weekly, June 1896, showing McKinley riding the rail of the currency question. Before the Republican convention, McKinley had been straddlebug on the currency question, favoring moderate positions on silver such as accomplishing bimetallism by international agreement. In the final days before the convention, McKinley decided, after hearing from politicians and businessmen, that the platform should endorse the gold standard, though it should allow for bimetallism by international agreement. Adoption of the platform caused some Western delegates, led by Colorado Senator Henry M. Teller, to walk out of the convention. However, compared with the Democrats, Republican divisions on the issue were small, especially as McKinley promised future concessions to silver advocates. The bad economic times had continued, and strengthened the hand of forces for free silver. The issue bitterly divided the Democratic Party. President Cleveland firmly supported the gold standard, but an increasing number of rural Democrats wanted silver, especially in the South and West. The Silverites took control of the 1896 Democratic National Convention and chose William Jennings Bryan for president. He had electrified the delegates with his Cross of Gold speech. Bryan's financial radicalism shocked bankers. They thought his inflationary program would bankrupt the railroads and ruin the economy. Hanna approached them for support for his strategy to win the election, and they gave $3.5 million for speakers and over 200 million pamphlets advocating the Republican position on the money and tariff questions. Historic recording of William McKinley. The final 1:08 of this sound file, starting at 5:40, contains an excerpt from one of his 1896 campaign speeches. Bryan's campaign had at most an estimated $500,000. With his eloquence and youthful energy his major assets in the race, Bryan decided on a whistle-stop political tour by train on an unprecedented scale. Hanna urged McKinley to match Bryan's tour with one of his own. The candidate declined on the grounds that the Democrat was a better stump speaker. "I might just as well set up a trapeze on my front lawn and compete with some professional athlete as go out speaking against Bryan. I have to think when I speak." Quote, William and Ida McKinley, to her husband's left, posed with members of the flower delegation from Oil City, Pennsylvania, before the McKinley home. Although women could not vote in most states, they might influence male relatives and were encouraged to visit Canton. McKinley made himself available to the public every day except Sunday, receiving delegations from the front porch of his home. The railroads subsidized the visitors with low excursion rates. The pro-silver Cleveland plain dealer disgustedly stated that going to Canton had been made cheaper than staying at home. A Man of Mark, 1896. Homer Davenport cartoon of McKinley as Hanna's creature. From William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal. Most Democratic newspapers refused to support Bryan, the major exception being the New York Journal, controlled by William Randolph Hearst, whose fortune was based on silver mines. In biased reporting and through the sharp cartoons of Homer Davenport, Hanna was viciously characterized as a plutocrat, trampling on labor. McKinley was drawn as a child, easily controlled by big business. For the people, it was a campaign of study and analysis, of exhortation and conviction, a campaign of search for economic and political truth. Pamphlets tumbled from the presses, to be read, reread, studied, debated, to become guides to economic thought and political action. They were printed and distributed by the million, but the people hankered for more. Favorite pamphlets became dog-eared, grimy, fell apart as their owners laboriously restudied their arguments and quoted from them in public and private debate. The battleground proved to be the Midwest. The South and most of the West were conceded to Bryan, and the Democrat spent much of his time in those crucial states. The 1896 presidential election is often seen as a realigning election, in which McKinley's view of a stronger central government building American industry through protective tariffs and a dollar based on gold triumphed. The voting patterns established then displaced the near deadlock the major parties had seen since the Civil War. The Republican dominance begun then would continue until 1932. Another realigning election with the ascent of Franklin Roosevelt. Presidency, inauguration and appointments. Chief Justice Melville Fuller swears in William McKinley as president. Outgoing President Grover Cleveland at right. McKinley was sworn in as president on March 4, 1897, as his wife and mother looked on. The new president gave a lengthy inaugural address. He urged tariff reform, and stated that the currency issue would have to await tariff legislation. He warned against foreign interventions. "We want no wars of conquest. We must avoid the temptation of territorial aggression." Quote, McKinley's most controversial cabinet appointment was that of John Sherman as Secretary of State. Sherman had an outstanding reputation, but old age was fast reducing his abilities. McKinley needed to have Hanna appointed to the Senate, so Senator Sherman was moved up. His failing abilities made for a poor cabinet officer. Maine Representative Nelson Dingley, Jr. was McKinley's choice for Secretary of the Treasury. He declined it, preferring to remain as chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. Charles Dawes, who had been Hanna's lieutenant in Chicago during the campaign, was considered for the Treasury post, but by some accounts Dawes considered himself too young. Dawes eventually became controller of the currency. He recorded in his published diary that he had strongly urged McKinley to appoint as secretary the successful candidate, Lyman J. Gage, president of the First National Bank of Chicago and a Gold Democrat. In addition to Sherman, McKinley made one other ill-advised cabinet appointment. In 1897, McKinley was elected an honorary member of the Pennsylvania Commandery of the Military Order of Foreign Wars and was assigned insignia number 107. Cabinet. At far left, William McKinley. Left to right in back of table, Lyman J. Gage, John W. Briggs, John D. Long, James Wilson Standing, and Cornelius N. Bliss. Left to right in front of table, John Hay, Russell A. Alger, and Charles E. Smith. Cuba crisis and war with Spain. For decades, rebels in Cuba had waged an intermittent campaign for freedom from Spanish colonial rule. By 1895, the conflict had expanded to a war for Cuban independence. In January 1898, Spain promised some concessions to the rebels, but when American consul Fitzhugh Lee reported riots in Havana, McKinley agreed to send the battleship USS Maine there to protect American lives and property. Editorial cartoon intervention in Cuba. Colombia. The American people reaches out to help oppressed Cuba in 1897 while Uncle Sam, the U.S. government, is blind to the crisis and will not use its powerful guns to help. Judge Magazine. February 6, 1897. The expansion of the telegraph and the development of the telephone gave McKinley greater control over the day-to-day management of the war than previous presidents had enjoyed, and he used the new technologies to direct the Army's and Navy's movements as far as he was able. Within a fortnight, the Navy had its first victory when the Asiatic Squadron, led by Commodore George II, destroyed the Spanish Navy at the Battle of Manila Bay in the Philippines. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean theater, a large force of regulars and volunteers gathered near Tampa, Florida, for an invasion of Cuba. Peace and territorial gain. McKinley's cabinet agreed with him that Spain must leave Cuba and Puerto Rico, but they disagreed on the Philippines, with some wishing to annex the entire archipelago and some wishing only to retain the naval base in the area. McKinley proposed to open negotiations with Spain on the basis of Cuban liberation and Puerto Rican annexation, with the final status of the Philippines subject to further discussion. During the war, McKinley also pursued the annexation of the Republic of Hawaii. The new republic, dominated by business interests, had overthrown the Queen in 1893 when she rejected a limited role for herself. Expanding influence overseas. Even before peace negotiations began with Spain, McKinley asked Congress to set up a commission to examine trade opportunities in Asia and espoused an open-door policy, in which all nations would freely trade with China and none would seek to violate that nation's territorial integrity. American soldiers scale the walls of Beijing to relieve the siege of the international legations. August 1900. American missionaries were threatened with death when the Boxer Rebellion menaced foreigners in China. Closer to home, McKinley and Hay engaged in negotiations with Britain over the possible construction of a canal across Central America. The Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, which the two nations signed in 1850, prohibited either from establishing exclusive control over a canal there. The war had exposed the difficulty of maintaining a two-ocean navy without a connection closer than Cape Horn. Tariffs and bimetallism. 1900 re-election poster celebrates McKinley standing tall on the gold standard with support from soldiers, sailors, businessmen, factory workers and professionals. McKinley had built his reputation in Congress on high tariffs, promising protection for American business and well-paid American factory workers. With the Republicans in control of Congress, Ways and Means Chairman Dingley introduced the Dingley Act, which would raise rates on wool, sugar, and luxury goods. McKinley supported it and it became law. American negotiators soon concluded a reciprocity treaty with France, and the two nations approached Britain to gauge British enthusiasm for bimetallism. Civil rights. In the wake of McKinley's election in 1896, African Americans were hopeful of progress towards equality. McKinley had spoken out against lynching while governor, and most African Americans who could vote supported him in 1896. McKinley's priority, however, was in ending sexualism, and they were disappointed by his policies and appointments. Although McKinley made some appointments of African Americans to low-level government posts, and received some praise for that, the appointments were less than they had received under previous Republican administrations. Blanche K. Bruce, an African American who during Reconstruction had served as senator from Mississippi, received the post of Register at the Treasury Department. This post was traditionally given to an African American by Republican presidents. McKinley appointed several black postmasters. However, when whites protested the appointment of Justin W. Lyons as postmaster of Augusta, Georgia, McKinley asked Lyons to withdraw. He was subsequently given the post of Treasury Register after Bruce's death in 1898. The administration's response to racial violence was minimal, causing him to lose black support. McKinley, right of center, flanked by Georgia Governor Allen D. Candler, front row to McKinley's right, and Gen. William Rufus Shafter, reviewing the Atlanta Peace Jubilee Parade, December 15, 1898. According to historian Clarence A. Becote, before the Spanish-American War, the Negroes, in spite of some mistakes, regarded McKinley as the best friend they ever had. Quote, 1900 election. Republicans were generally successful in state and local elections around the country in 1899, and McKinley was optimistic about his chances at re-election in 1900. When the Republican convention began in Philadelphia that June, no vice presidential candidate had overwhelming support, but Roosevelt had the broadest range of support from around the country. The candidates were the same, but the issues of the campaign had shifted. Free silver was still a question that animated many voters, but the Republicans focused on victory in war and prosperity at home as issues they believed favored their party. Second term. Soon after his second inauguration on March 4, 1901, William and Ida McKinley undertook a 6-week tour of the nation, traveling mostly by rail. The McKinleys were to travel through the South to the Southwest, and then up the Pacific coast and east again, to conclude with a visit on June 13, 1901, to the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. Assassination and death throes. Although McKinley enjoyed meeting the public, Cortelyou was concerned with his security due to recent assassinations by anarchists in Europe, such as the assassination of King Umberto I of Italy the previous year, and twice tried to remove a public reception from the president's rescheduled visit to the exposition. McKinley refused, and Cortelyou arranged for additional security for the trip. One man in the crowd, Leon Czolgosz, hoped to assassinate McKinley. He had managed to get close to the presidential podium, but did not fire, uncertain of hitting his target. McKinley urged his aides to break the news gently to Ida, and to call off the mob that had set on Czolgosz, a request that may have saved his assassin's life. In the days after the shooting, McKinley appeared to improve. Doctors issued increasingly optimistic bulletins. Members of the cabinet, who had rushed to Buffalo on hearing the news, dispersed. Vice President Roosevelt departed on a camping trip to the Adirondacks. Leach wrote, "It is difficult to interpret the optimism with which the president's physicians looked for his recovery. There was obviously the most serious danger that his wounds would become septic. In that case, he would almost certainly die, since drugs to control infection did not exist. Unknown to the doctors, the gangrene that would kill him was growing on the walls of his stomach, slowly poisoning his blood." On the morning of September 13, McKinley took a turn for the worse. Relatives and friends gathered around the deathbed. At 2:15 a.m. on September 14, President McKinley died. Theodore Roosevelt had rushed back and took the oath of office as president in Buffalo. Czolgosz, put on trial for murder 9 days after McKinley's death, was found guilty, sentenced to death on September 26, and executed by electric chair on October 29, 1901. Funeral, memorials, and legacy. Funeral and resting place. According to Gould, the nation experienced a wave of genuine grief at the news of McKinley's passing. Quote, "There was a widespread expectation that Ida McKinley would not long survive her husband," one family friend stated, as William McKinley lay dying. that they should be prepared for a double funeral. Other memorials. In addition to the Canton site, there are many memorials to McKinley. There is a monument at his birthplace in Niles. 20 Ohio schools bear his name. In 1896, a gold prospector gave McKinley's name to Denali, the tallest mountain in North America at 2,310 feet, in support of the then newly minted Republican nominee for president. The Alaska Board of Geographic Names changed the name of the mountain back to Denali in 1975, which is what it was called by locals. The Department of the Interior followed suit in August 2015 as a part of a visit to Alaska by President Barack Obama. Legacy and historical image. McKinley's biographer, H. Wayne Morgan, remarks that McKinley died the most beloved president in history. There has been broad agreement among historians that McKinley's election was at the time of a transition between two political eras, dubbed the third and fourth party systems. Phillips writes that McKinley's low rating is undeserved, and that he should be ranked just after the great presidents such as Washington and Lincoln. He pointed to McKinley's success at building an electoral coalition that kept the Republicans mostly in power for a generation. A controversial aspect of McKinley's presidency is territorial expansion and the question of imperialism. With the exception of the Philippines, granted independence in 1946, the United States retains the territories taken under McKinley. McKinley was a major actor in some of the most important events in American history. His decisions shaped future policies and public attitudes. He usually rises in the estimation of scholars who study his life in detail. Even those who disagree with his policies and decisions see him as an active, responsible, informed participant in charge of decision-making. His dignified demeanor and subtle operations keep him somewhat remote from public perception. But he is once again at the center of events. Where he started. Louisiana Purchase Exposition stamp honoring McKinley, who had signed a bill authorizing a subsidy for that upcoming event.